June 23, 1985. A Boeing 747 cruises at 31,000 feet over the Atlantic, 120 miles off Ireland's southwest coast. Its name, Emperor Kanishka. On board, 329 people headed home. 307 passengers, 22 crew. Most are Canadian, flying to India for summer weddings, graduations, reunions with parents they haven't seen in years. Sunday morning, no warnings, no distress calls. Then at 8:13 a.m., Air India Flight 182 vanishes from radar. No mayday, no word, just gone. Seconds later, all 329 people are dead. The wreckage falls toward the ocean. This is the deadliest act of aviation terrorism before 9/11, still Canada's worst terrorist attack in history. Decades later, investigators are still piecing together exactly how it happened. To understand what was lost, you have to understand who was on that plane. It started in Toronto, picked up most passengers in Montreal, then continued toward London, Delhi, and Bombay. Of the 329 on board, 268 held Canadian citizenship. A striking number were highly educated professionals, doctors, pharmacists, engineers, professors. Take the Sharma family. Shakuntala Sharma, a high school vice principal, was taking her first vacation in 40 years to see her daughters in Canada. Her daughter Uma had just finished first in her PhD zoology program and won a gold medal for it. Uma's daughters Sanja, 14, and Swati, 11, traveled with her. Swati had already published 2 poems by age 11. She wanted to be an electrical engineer. Then the Khandelwal sisters, Chandra and Manju. Manju blew through high school in 2 years, pre-med in 1, and started medical school at 18. Now 19, she was about to begin her 2nd year. Her sister Chandra played flute well enough to be called a musician as much as a student. Their younger brother Deepak had a ticket for this exact flight, but skipped it for a summer computer scholarship in Calgary. That single decision is the only reason his name isn't read out at memorials every June. These weren't just passengers, they were an entire slice of a community gathered on one aircraft on one morning. Flight 182 pushed back from Montreal an hour and 38 minutes late. In aviation, a late departure is background noise, not a warning sign. In the cockpit sat Captain Hanse Singh Narendra, 56, closing in on retirement after decades with Air India. Over 20,000 flying hours, more than 6,400 of them on this exact aircraft type. Few pilots alive had crossed oceans this many times. The cockpit wasn't the only place where careers and family overlapped that morning. In-flight supervisor Sampat Lazar worked the cabin beside his own wife and daughter, both Air India employees. Purser Inderjit Thakur had his wife and child with him. Purser Satwinder Singh traveled with his wife and son. For these families, this wasn't just a shift, it was a family outing that happened to come with a paycheck. Parents showing their kids what they did for a living, 31,000 feet up. Multiply that by 329 people, and the scale comes into focus. And captain's entire career, several families working side by side, children riding along to a job instead of a vacation. 3 hours later, none of that would matter. Flight 182 climbed into cruise. Somewhere in the cabin, mechanical engineer Syed Ather Quadri sat with his wife Shaista and their 3 children, Rubina, 9, Arisha, 4, and baby Atif, just 10 months. A family of 5 headed toward a life they'd planned together on the other side of the world. By 8 a.m., The aircraft was 120 miles off Ireland's southwest coast, cruising at 31,000 feet. Air traffic control in Shannon was expecting a routine handoff, the same one they'd run 1,000 times with 1,000 other flights. Then at 8:13 a.m., everything stopped. No radio call, no warning, no word. No time for anyone in that cabin, including a 10-month-old in his mother's arms, to understand what was happening. One moment, Flight 182 existed on a radar screen in Shannon. Then it didn't. What made an aircraft carrying 329 people disappear without a single distress signal is a question investigators would spend years answering. For families waiting in Toronto, Montreal, Delhi, and Bombay, the not knowing started long before any answers came. If you were on the ground that morning, waiting for a plane that was never going to land, what's the first thing you think you'd have needed to hear? Tell me in the comments before we get into what investigators actually found. Word of the disappearance didn't reach families through official channels, it reached them through television. At home in Ontario, one mother got a phone call from a friend before dawn. Her husband picked up. When he hung up, he could barely speak. She turned on the news and watched her family's flight and her son's become a headline. By then, an RAF Nimrod reconnaissance plane was already circling the crash site, dropping smoke floats and flares to guide the first vessels toward debris scattered across the water. Word moved fast, through Shannon air traffic control, through Air India's offices in Toronto and Bombay, through newsrooms on 3 continents, all converging on the same impossible fact. Flight 182 was gone, and nobody yet knew why. Among the 329 names investigators would confirm was Manju Khandelwal, 19, the young woman who'd finished high school in 2 years, pre-med in 1, and was about to begin her 2nd year of medical school. Before all of that, she'd spent her teenage years volunteering as a hospital candy striper, the kind of kid who chose to spend free time helping strangers heal. She never got the chance to become the doctor she was already becoming. That's the shape grief was taking across 2 continents that Sunday morning. Not one tragedy, but hundreds of individual futures erased in the same instant, families finding out one broadcast at a time. 19 vessels were now racing toward the same stretch of ocean. What they found there is where this gets harder to sit with. By late morning, the Irish naval vessel Aisling reached the debris field and lowered a small inflatable boat crewed by just 3 people. Their job? Pull bodies from open water, one at a time, for hours, surrounded by wreckage that had been a 747 hours earlier. Petty Officer Mossy Mahan and leading seaman John McGrath went into the water itself. The seas were shark-infested. They dove in anyway. There was no other way to bring people home. On the merchant ship Laurentian Forest, 3rd Officer Mark Stagg spent that same day lifting bodies from the waves. Decades later, he'd described the moment simply. Pulling a dead child from the water that morning is when something in him changed for good, something he says he still carries every day. None of the bodies recovered wore life jackets. Some still had their airline slippers on, as if the flight had still been routine seconds before it wasn't. On land, the response matched the water. Cork Regional Hospital staff showed up voluntarily, over 100 strong. A gymnasium became a temporary morgue overnight. Taxi drivers refused fares. Local families opened their homes to grieving relatives who spoke different languages and prayed in different ways, because by then, none of that mattered. By the end of the operation, 132 bodies had been recovered. 197 were never found, lost permanently to the Atlantic. The physical search was over. Investigators were only beginning a very different search, one that would take years to answer how a bomb ended up on this aircraft in the first place.
While ships circled the wreckage off Ireland, investigators 3,000 miles away were staring at a second scene that changed everything. 55 minutes before Flight 182 vanished from radar, a suitcase exploded inside a baggage room at Narita Airport in Tokyo. 2 men were loading it onto a connecting flight when it went off. Hidehar Koda and Hideo Asano, baggage handlers doing the same job they'd done 1,000 times before. They never had a chance to know what hit them.
That bag had flown in from Vancouver, tagged to continue on to another Air India plane bound for Bangkok and Delhi. It detonated in a sorting room instead of at altitude. Investigators would later believe the timer had simply been set for the wrong hour, because whoever built it hadn't accounted for the fact that Japan doesn't observe daylight saving time. One name on that Vancouver flights list stood out immediately: a man using the name L. Singh, who had checked a bag onto the plane and then never boarded it. No record showed he'd ever entered Japan. He was simply gone. 2 bombs, 2 flights, both from the same city, the same morning, both meant for Air India aircraft. This was no longer a mystery about mechanical failure or pilot error. Somebody had built these devices on purpose, and somebody had walked away before they went off. For the family still waiting on news from the Atlantic, this changed everything. Their husbands, wives, and children hadn't died in an accident. They'd been targeted. Word of Narita reached investigators in Ireland within hours. But knowing a bomb was involved was only the beginning. Now they had to prove it, using a jet that was lying in pieces 2 miles under the ocean. Proving a bomb brought down Flight 182 meant finding 2 small recorders resting somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, in water so deep sunlight never reached it. The wreckage lay scattered across the seabed nearly 6,700 feet down, more than a mile beneath the surface. No diver could reach that depth. Search teams brought in specialized ships instead: the British vessel Guard Line Locator, sweeping the ocean floor with sonar, and the French cable repair ship Léon Thévenin, carrying an unmanned submersible called Scarab 1, a robot normally used to fix broken undersea telephone cables, now hunting for evidence of mass murder. For nearly 2 weeks, they searched in total darkness, guided only by faint pings from the recorder's locator beacons. In mid-July, Scarab 1 closed its mechanical arms around the cockpit voice recorder and carried it to the surface. Within a day, it found the flight data recorder too. Both were intact enough to be read. What investigators found lined up with everything Narita had already suggested. This hadn't been engine failure. It hadn't been weather. Somewhere in the belly of that aircraft, something had been built to go off high over open water, far from any coastline, where the evidence was meant to disappear forever. They now knew what had killed 329 people. They still didn't know who had built the device, who had checked it onto the aircraft, or why an ordinary Sunday flight full of families had been chosen as a target. That answer would take years to fully unravel. But the moment those 2 recorders reached the surface, this stopped being a search and rescue story. It became one of the largest criminal investigations Canada had ever launched. Everything the investigation would later confirm traces back to one suitcase, checked in at Vancouver under a name nobody could confirm was real, then quietly transferred through Toronto and loaded into cargo bin 52 left, a few feet below where passengers slept, read, or watched their children finally drift off after a long night in the air. By 8:13 that morning, Flight 182 had been in the sky for almost 6 hours. In the cabin, Shaista Quadri may still have been holding baby Atif, 10 months old, the way she had for most of the overnight crossing. Somewhere nearby, Shakuntala Sharma was likely dozing beside her granddaughters, Sandhya and Swati, on the first vacation she'd taken in 40 years.
Manju Khandelwal, 19, and one summer away from her second year of medical school, was 307 passengers deep into a flight none of them knew was already counting down. In the cockpit, Captain Narendra had flown this ocean more times than he could count. None of those 20,000 hours could have prepared him for what was about to happen. There was no structural groan, no depressurization alarm, nothing the crew had seconds to react to. The aircraft came apart almost instantly, 31,000 feet above the Atlantic.
Shannon Air Traffic Control never received a mayday because there was no time to send one. The radar blip that had been Flight 182 simply stopped existing. In that same instant, 3,000 miles away in Calgary, Deepak Khandelwal was alive only because a summer scholarship had kept him off the very flight his sisters were on. 329 people, gone in less time than it takes to read this sentence. In the end, only one man was ever convicted for what happened to those 329 people. Inderjeet Singh Rayat pleaded guilty for manslaughter for helping build the bomb and served 5 years. 2 other men stood trial for murder in 2003, acquitted in 2005. The mastermind investigators believed had ordered it all, Talwinder Singh Parmar, was killed in India in 1992, years before he ever faced a Canadian courtroom. To this day, the RCMP still lists the case as active. For the families, closure never came from a verdict. It came from something quieter. 1 year after the crash, on the closest point of Irish land to where the ocean had taken their families, relatives helped unveil a stone sundial in the village of Ahakista, built so that every June 23rd at exactly 8:13 in the morning, sunlight falls directly across it, the precise minute Flight 182 vanished from radar. 2 decades later, Toronto built its own memorial at Humber Bay, a matching sundial and a curved wall of names, deliberately angled to face across the ocean toward Ireland. Manju and Chandra Khandelwal's names are carved into that wall now, 2 of 329, next to every other family who lost someone that June morning. Every year on the anniversary, relatives still gather at both memorials, reading each name out loud so the world doesn't forget them. Only one person was ever punished for taking 329 lives. Was that justice or nowhere near enough? Tell me what you think in the comments. If stories like this, the ones aviation history would rather people forget, matter to you, subscribe. There's another one waiting. And if you want to see a disaster that could have been stopped with one overlooked warning, watch this next.